What if the most dangerous secret in human history isn't buried in a vault? What if it's buried under 2 miles of ice? The United States and the Soviet Union have enough nuclear warheads pointed at each other to turn the planet into ash. Twice. Every diplomatic handshake is a performance. Every summit is theater. These two empires hate each other at a cellular level. And then, 11 months. That's all it took. 11 months, and suddenly, sworn enemies are signing the same document. Smiling for the same cameras, agreeing on the same patch of Earth. Arms control negotiations, 40 years still going. Berlin, divided for decades. Nuclear treaties argued over for generations. But Antarctica, that frozen, windswept, half-explored continent at the bottom of the world, was sealed, locked, and handed to no one in 11 months flat. 12 nations, one table. And a decision that every government on Earth has honored ever since, without question, without rebellion, without a single public explanation for the impossible speed. The question that nobody is supposed to ask is, what did they find down there? Black screen, title card emerges. Slow and cold. The frozen accord the treaty that turned enemies into guardians. There is a place at the bottom of the world where the wind moves like a living thing, where it doesn't just blow. It screams, a sustained, unbroken howl that has been going on for longer than recorded human history. A place where the temperature doesn't just fall, it collapses, plunging to -80, -90 degrees Fahrenheit, until the very moisture in a man's exhaled breath crystallizes before it can drift 6 inches from his lips. A place so hostile, so alien, so magnificently indifferent to human survival that for most of history, mankind simply looked at it from a distance and decided, with remarkable collective wisdom, to leave it alone. That place is Antarctica, and it holds a secret that 12 of the most powerful governments on Earth agreed, in the span of 11 months, to bury together. To understand what happened in 1959, you have to first understand the world that produced it. Because 1959 was not a year of cooperation. It was not a year of handshakes and goodwill. It was a year of coiled, vibrating, barely contained mutual annihilation. The Cold War in the late 1950s wasn't cold in the sense of distant or detached. It was cold the way a knife blade is cold, the kind of cold that carries a cutting edge. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in an arms race that had long ago passed the point of rational deterrence and entered the realm of existential theater. Both sides had enough thermonuclear warheads to end civilization not once, but several times over. The missiles were aimed. The submarines were deployed. The bombers were airborne, rotating in shifts, never landing, never standing down. Every morning that the world woke up intact was, in some technical sense, a statistical accident. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, a metal sphere the size of a beach ball, into orbit, and in doing so, shattered the American assumption of technological superiority. The message was unmistakable and terrifying. If we can put a satellite into space, we can put a warhead anywhere on Earth. Washington went into a controlled panic. The military budget exploded. Civil defense drills had children in American schools crawling under wooden desks, as if pine furniture would somehow provide shelter from a hydrogen bomb. The Berlin crisis of 1958 had brought Europe to the edge. Soviet Premier Khrushchev gave the West an ultimatum over the divided city, and for several months, generals on both sides were doing the kind of quiet, careful math that soldiers do when they're trying to calculate casualty numbers. This was the world. This was the air that diplomats breathed, and it was into this world, this atmosphere of pure, weaponized distrust, that something extraordinary happened in 1958. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, the former Supreme Allied Commander, the man who had personally overseen the liberation of Western Europe, the man who understood better than almost anyone alive what organized military power actually looked like in practice. He sent out invitations. Quiet invitations, the kind that don't generate press releases. 12 nations received the call: the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, France, Argentina, Chile, Australia, New Zealand, Norway, Belgium, South Africa, Japan. Some of these nations were NATO allies standing shoulder to shoulder against Soviet expansion. Some were Soviet bloc members or Soviet sympathizers. Some were neutral. Several had actively competing territorial claims over the same Antarctic land. Argentina and Chile, for instance, had overlapping claims that had nearly come to blows on multiple occasions. And Britain's claim overlapped with both of theirs. These were not nations that agreed on anything easily. They were not nations that trusted each other at a conference table. They came anyway. The Washington Conference of 1958 has never received the kind of historical attention its outcome deserves. It doesn't occupy the dramatic space of Yalta, or the moral weight of Nuremberg, or the geopolitical significance of Bretton Woods. It is discussed, when it is discussed at all, in the language of environmental science and international law, dry, procedural, almost deliberately boring. And that, if you are paying attention, is itself remarkable, because the outcome of that conference was anything but boring. The outcome was a treaty that gave no nation sovereignty over an entire continent. An entire continent, larger than Europe, larger than the contiguous United States, was declared by collective agreement to belong to no one. All territorial claims were frozen, and that word frozen hangs in the air like something deliberately chosen. Frozen, not resolved, not abandoned, not negotiated, simply suspended, put on ice. As if the matter was too complex or too dangerous to resolve permanently, and so it was simply agreed that no one would touch it. Article 1 of the Antarctic Treaty reads, on its surface, like a statement of peaceful intention. Antarctica, it declares, shall be used for peaceful purposes only. Military activities, the establishment of military bases, the conduct of military maneuvers, the testing of any weapons are expressly prohibited. When you first read this, it sounds like an admirable gesture of restraint. Two superpowers, staring each other down across the nuclear abyss, agreeing to keep at least one corner of the world free from their competition. But read it again. Read it the way a lawyer reads a contract, looking not at what it says but at what it does. The militarization ban means that no nation can send its military forces to Antarctica without the explicit consent of the treaty framework, without, in other words, the approval of the original signatories. The 12 nations that sat at that table in Washington in 1958 did not merely agree to keep Antarctica peaceful. They agreed to serve as the permanent gatekeepers of the continent. Any nation that wants access, not military access, not territorial access, but any access beyond what the treaty defines as scientific research, must operate within the framework that those 12 nations constructed. The door to Antarctica was not left open. It was locked, and the 12 men who sat at that table kept the keys. Article 7 is where the architecture of control becomes undeniable. The consultative parties to the treaty, that original group of signatories, have the right to inspect any and all facilities in Antarctica at any time without prior notice. They can send inspectors to any station, any base, any research outpost without warning and examine it completely. This is described in the language of the treaty as a transparency measure, a way of ensuring that the military ban is being honored, and perhaps it is. But consider for a moment what it actually means in practice. It means that every nation operating in Antarctica is under continuous, mutual surveillance by every other nation operating in Antarctica. Not occasional surveillance. Not surveillance triggered by suspicion. Constant, permanent, institutionalized surveillance, normalized from the very first day of the treaty's existence. No other international agreement in history, not the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, not the Geneva Conventions, not the UN Charter, contains an inspection regime this invasive, this automatic, and this unapologetically comprehensive. You do not build a surveillance architecture like that to monitor whether someone is conducting science. You build it to make sure no one is getting too close to something specific. Think about the geography for a moment. Antarctica is not a uniform landscape. It has mountains and valleys, coastlines and interior plains. It has subglacial lakes, bodies of liquid water, kept unfrozen by geothermal heat, sealed beneath kilometers of ice, isolated from the surface world for millions of years. Lake Vostok, the largest of these, is roughly the size of Lake Ontario, and it has been cut off from the rest of the planet's biosphere for somewhere between 15 and 25 million years. What lives in that water, what has evolved in that darkness, under that pressure, in that total isolation, we do not yet fully know. The first attempts to drill through to its surface didn't happen until 2012. And what those drillers found, or what they found and chose not to announce, remains a matter of active scientific debate and, in certain circles, considerably more pointed discussion. But the subglacial lakes are only one layer of the mystery. During the late 1950s, both the United States and the Soviet Union were conducting serious, well-funded Antarctic expeditions. Operation High Jump, the American mission led by Admiral Richard Byrd in 1946 and 1947, had already mapped significant portions of the continent and returned with findings that were, by the accounts of participants, unexpected in ways that were never fully explained to the public. Admiral Byrd himself, in the years following the expedition, made statements that his superiors clearly wished he hadn't made, statements about the strategic importance of the continent that went beyond any conventional military calculus of the era. The Soviet expeditions of the mid-1950s were similarly extensive, similarly well-resourced, and similarly quiet about their specific findings. By 1958, both superpowers had teams on the ice. Teams with equipment. Teams with scientists who were, in the Cold War context, also intelligence assets, because every scientist on either side was an intelligence asset. That was simply how the system worked. And both teams, in the interior of the continent, were finding things that generated classified reports that went straight to the highest levels of both governments. We do not know what those reports said. The relevant American documents are partially declassified, but the portions that deal with specific interior findings remain redacted, blacked out in that distinctive way that tells you the information isn't being protected because it's embarrassing, but because it's still considered sensitive. The Soviet records, what has emerged of them in the post-Cold War document releases, contain similar gaps, similar silences in the exact places where you would expect specifics. What we know is what happened afterward. What we know is that two governments which could not agree on anything, not Berlin, not Korea, not nuclear testing, not trade, not the basic organizing principles of human civilization, somehow found themselves at the same table within months of those expeditions concluding, drafting language that locked a continent down tight. The theory that has circulated among a narrow community of serious researchers, not conspiracy theorists, but people with genuine expertise in Cold War history and Antarctic geology, is that what both expeditions found was something that neither government could exploit alone. and that neither government could afford to let the other exploit first. The precise nature of the finding is, by definition, speculative, but the possibilities that have been seriously proposed by credentialed researchers are themselves extraordinary. One theory centers on energy, specifically, on evidence of a geothermal energy source, or a mineral formation of such scale and purity that whoever controlled it could, within a generation, achieve energy independence so complete as to fundamentally alter the global balance of power. In the nuclear era, energy independence wasn't merely economic, it was strategic. A nation that didn't need oil didn't need the Middle East. A nation that didn't need the Middle East didn't need alliances that constrained its options. The implications cascaded outward in every direction. Another theory is biological, specifically, concerning the subglacial lake systems and what they might contain. If those sealed, ancient water bodies harbored microbial life with properties, enzymatic, chemical, metabolic properties, that could be weaponized or harvested for pharmaceutical or biological purposes, the implications were staggering. In the context of the Cold War, where both sides were actively developing biological weapons programs, the discovery of novel microbial life with unknown capabilities would not have been a scientific curiosity. It would have been a military asset of the first order. A third theory, the most dramatic and the least provable, concerns structural anomalies, formations beneath the ice that don't fit standard geological models. Detected during the seismic surveys both expeditions conducted. These surveys, designed to map the bedrock topography beneath the ice sheet, produced results in certain interior regions that remain classified, and in some documented cases, produced readings that the scientists on the ground reportedly described, in field notes that have since been heavily redacted, as inconsistent with known geological processes. What those inconsistencies were, what they suggested, what conclusions the scientists drew, and what those conclusions triggered in the classified reports that went back to Washington and Moscow, we do not know. What we know is the treaty. What we know is that, for the last 65 years, that treaty has held with a fidelity that no other international agreement of comparable scope can match. Nations that have gone to war with each other, that have severed diplomatic relations, that have imposed crushing sanctions and expelled each other's ambassadors, those same nations, with clockwork reliability, have continued to honor every clause of the Antarctic Treaty. Argentina and Britain fought a war over the Falkland Islands in 1982. The Falklands are, by latitude, a gateway to Antarctica. And yet both countries, even as their soldiers were dying 800 miles to the north, continued to operate their Antarctic stations in quiet compliance with the treaty framework, continued to allow each other's inspectors access, continued to maintain the perimeter. That is not the behavior of nations honoring a good idea. That is the behavior of nations honoring a shared secret. Today, there are more than 70 permanent and seasonal research stations on the continent. They are staffed by scientists and support personnel from dozens of nations. Some of those support personnel have military backgrounds. Some of that equipment has dual-use applications. The treaty's inspectors make their rounds, filing reports that are circulated among the consultative parties and in key sections, nowhere else. The science that emerges from Antarctica, the climate data, the ice core samples, the atmospheric measurements, is published in journals and presented at conferences, and is, by all appearances, exactly what it claims to be. But the science that doesn't emerge, the findings that don't make it into journals, the ice cores that are drilled and cataloged and then moved to secure facilities rather than university labs, the seismic data from the interior, the chemical analyses of the subglacial water samples, The anomalous readings from the magnetometric surveys that map what lies, in extraordinary density and complexity, beneath 2 miles of ancient ice. That science goes somewhere else. It goes to the people who have been keeping the secret since 1958. The Antarctic Treaty was renewed in 1991, extended indefinitely, its core provisions locked in place for as long as its signatories choose to honor it. The consultative parties have expanded. There are now 54 signatory nations, but the original 12 retain their status as the founding guardians, the ones whose agreement to the framework is structurally irreplaceable. Any fundamental revision to the treaty requires consensus, and the original 12 hold, in effect, a collective veto over any proposal that would fundamentally alter the nature of the access restrictions. 65 years of consensus, 65 years of mutual inspection, 65 years of a frozen continent at the bottom of the world, watched over by a rotating cast of scientists and support staff and quiet intelligence personnel, all operating under the same framework, all bound by the same agreements, all keeping the same perimeter. And at the center of that perimeter, somewhere beneath 2 miles of ice, in the absolute darkness of a continent that has never known a human footprint, whatever those expeditions found in 1958 remains undisturbed. Or so we are meant to believe. There is a phenomenon that intelligence historians call the silence of comprehension. It refers to the particular quality of silence that falls in a room or between nations when every party present understands something so clearly, so completely, and so terrifyingly that speech becomes not just unnecessary but dangerous. You don't speak the thing out loud. You don't write it in the minutes. You draft a treaty. You assign inspectors. You build a legal framework around it like a containment vessel, and you agree, without ever saying so explicitly, that the vessel will hold. The Antarctic Treaty of 1959 has that quality. It has the silence of comprehension, 11 months from first conversation to final signature. No other treaty of comparable scope or consequence in the history of modern diplomacy was negotiated in 11 months. The Outer Space Treaty, which addressed territory with considerably less potential for immediate exploitation, took 2 years. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty took more than a decade of negotiations. The Law of the Sea Convention took 9 years of formal conferences alone. But Antarctica, an entire continent with active competing territorial claims between nations that were literally aiming nuclear weapons at each other, was settled in 11 months. Something was found on the ice, something that made enemies into brothers and brothers into guardians, something that 65 years later is still being watched. And the ice, 2 miles of it, pressing down on whatever lies beneath, is still keeping its silence. Antarctica isn't just a continent, it is the world's most successful secret. And the treaty that sealed it is not a monument to human cooperation. It is a monument to human fear.